Hi everyone, welcome back to my podcast. Today we're going to be taking a look at a tumultuous situation in Guatemala that took place during the late 20th century and talk about how there are important ideas about development that we can learn from this situation. For this assignment, rather than analyzing the readings and then choosing a situation to apply them to, I wanted to kind of turn that on its head. I wanted to select a situation, one that I'm familiar with, and then look at the readings and see what I could extract. I wanted to do this because I think that it is a more realistic experience of what working in tough situations might be like. Rather than having a clear roadmap, I think a lot of times I'll find myself in a situation and then have to think through all the approaches that could be taken. So that's what I aim to do here. I want to kind of pick and choose different parts of these development articles and ideas and see how they might be applied to the situation with indigenous communities in Guatemala. In order to give context, first I will talk about the situation in Guatemala, the story that we're working with. This will be our backdrop and the background information that we will have in mind while thinking about the ideas presented by these development scholars. So this story is about indigenous communities in Guatemala during the Guatemalan Civil War that took place from 1960 to 1996, as told by one indigenous woman in particular, Rigoberta Menchú. Menchú has written two books, the first of which was written in 1982, and its title in English is I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian Woman in Guatemala. In Spanish, the language in which it was originally published, the title translates closer to My name is Rigoberta Menchú, and this is how my consciousness was born. So there's sort of an interesting difference between the titles in English versus in Spanish. Her second book is titled Crossing Borders, and it is sort of a sequel to her first book, but for today's podcast, we'll be focusing only on the first book, I, Rigoberta Menchú. I'll kind of paraphrase what the book is about, or give a synopsis. So Menchú is part of an indigenous community of Guatemalans that stem from the Mayans. There are still several Mayan groups alive in Guatemala, and Menchú's community is one such group. She grew up in the rural mountainside in Guatemala, and her first language was not Spanish, but rather the Mayan language spoken by her community. Throughout the book, one of the most important underlying themes is the tight bond and unity that her community holds. She portrays her community in a way that is very familial, and it's clear that there is a very strong connection between each one of its members. She talks about how when she was growing up, in order to earn money, her community would migrate to plantations called fincas to work as laborers picking cotton and coffee beans. This was the way they generated income and was by working hard for the plantation owners, who were not indigenous but rather mixed with the Hispanic Europeans that came to Guatemala during colonialization. She talks about how community members like her parents would actually make very little money doing this work because they would rack up debt with the plantation owners, so a lot of their wages never even left their plantation and made it back to their homes. Menchú's father was a leader in the community, and Menchú claims in her book that she had very little education because her father did not want her leaving the community to go to school and thus risk losing part of her indigenous culture and identity. Well, later on in life as a young woman, Menchú moved to Guatemala City, the capital of Guatemala, where she worked as a maid. She talks about the discrimination that she faced there as an indigenous woman and how the woman she worked for mistreated her and the other maids. Well, while all this was going on, there were guerrillas forming in the Guatemalan mountainside near indigenous communities such as the one Menchú was from, where her parents and siblings still lived. These guerrillas were forming to fight back against the discrimination and violence often carried out against indigenous people, particularly by the government and armed forces. Well, things escalated, and it eventually became a full-fledged civil war, where you had these indigenous and rural guerrillas fighting against the Guatemalan army. It was very much a portion or a percentage of the citizens fighting against the state, who was also fighting back. Well, a lot of times indigenous communities like Menchú's would start supporting the guerrillas, which jeopardized these indigenous communities' safety from the state. The state and its armed forces started punishing indigenous communities for their allegiance to the guerrillas, so much so that it came to a point where even people who weren't sympathetic to the guerrillas were targeted and punished because they were suspected to be revolutionaries or loyal to the counter movement. Well, in 1978, Menchú's father formed a political group called the Peasant Unity Committee, which was essentially a group of people who wanted to push back against the state politically. And unsurprisingly, this sparked even more violence and retaliation from the state. Menchú talks about many atrocities that the state carried out against indigenous people, including her own family, since they were leaders rallying groups of their indigenous peers. She talks about how her mother was brutally raped and killed by soldiers in the Guatemalan army. One of her brothers was shot and killed by the military, and another one of her brothers was burned alive in front of his entire community, so as to put forth a message of what would happen to you if you rebelled and fought with the guerrillas. Eventually, the Civil War came to a point during the burning of the Spanish embassy in 1980. This burning was basically an event in which indigenous peoples occupied the building, forth a political message and political resistance, and then a police raid ensued, which ended with the building burning and a shootout by the police, which left dozens of people dead, including Menchu's father. At this point, most of her family was dead, and communities like hers were still facing incredible hardship by the Guatemalan government. So Menchu decided to kind of take the reins of her father's political legacy and to start working as a leader and an activist herself. She had already been involved in the movement before her family. Afterwards, that she threw all of her weight into it. Eventually, the war ended, and even though things are far from perfect and there was a mass loss of life and destruction of property, indigenous communities did eventually gain some benefits and see some improvements in their political and social dealings than they did before the war. As a result of this successful movement, Menchu gained a lot of attention for her leadership, and her story was eventually published in her book. The publication process was a bit unconventional, however, because the book was technically written by a Venezuelan anthropologist named Elizabeth Burgos de Prey. What happened is that Menchu went to Burgos' home in Paris for a week, where Menchu told her stories and experiences orally. And it's also important to keep in mind that she was speaking in Spanish, which she had learned over the years, especially while living in Guatemala City, these stories in her second language. Burgos recorded all of the interviews and then transcribed them, putting them in order so as to tell a cohesive story from the beginning of the book till the end. So it's really a form of autobiography told by Menchu, but it was written and published by Burgos de Prey. It's a classic example of a Latin American literary form or genre called the testimonio, or testimony, in which one person or representative shares their stories in order to represent an entire community. So this one person takes on the stories of their community and presents them as a kind of ambassador for their community. Why is this important? Well, the last part of the context that I want to discuss before we dive into the development articles is that in 1999, 17 years after the original publication of her book, an American anthropologist named David Stoll published a book that challenged many of the claims that are present in Menchu's book. He essentially said that Menchu changed parts of her story to fit her agenda and to hyperbolize, essentially, what actually happened between indigenous groups and the Guatemalan army. It really was not clear what Stoll's intentions were or why he took the time to travel to Guatemala and interview some people that knew Menchu in order to debunk her story. But basically what happened is that other anthropologists and historians read both narratives and were able to determine that Stoll was mostly wrong in his book, that many of the points which he said were fabricated actually checked out in Menchu's favor. However, there were 2 points with which it seems like Stoll may actually have been right. The first being that Menchu received more formal education than she implied or let on in her book. This is that idea of her father not wanting her to leave the community in order to pursue an education because he feared that she would lose parts of her indigenous identity. Well, Stoll basically said that this was not really true and that she did in fact receive some formal education. The second point that was challenged by Stoll was Menchu's account of watching her brother burn at the stake in front of the entire community. Stoll claimed that Menchu falsely placed herself at the scene of the burning because he was able to prove that she was not physically there when it happened. With this in mind, I want to turn towards the articles that I read for this assignment. The first ones I want to discuss are Worf and Giovanni. The main idea of Worf's article is that grammatical structures totally impact the way we see the world. He says that grammar shapes ways of living and that it enforces cultural grooves onto us from which we cannot ever really come out of. This is what he writes. There is a relation between a language and the rest of the culture of the society which uses it. There are cases where the fashions of speaking are closely integrated with the whole general culture, whether or not this be universally true, and there are connections within this integration between the kind of linguistic analyses employed and various behavioral reactions, and also the shapes taken by various cultural developments. The reason I want to think about this point is because throughout Menchu's entire book, she stresses the communal nature of her community. There's very much a group-based mentality or philosophy or psychology that impacts the way they interact with each other and how they understand their place in the world and in their country. The theme of community is one of the most important traits of Menchu's book. And how this relates to Worf is that I don't speak the indigenous language of her community, but it would seem very likely, based on the way that Mengchu talks about her community, that their language and grammar are also communally focused or communally natured. This is important when thinking about Stoll's accusations that that Menchu falsified being at the scene of her brother's burning, because basically what researchers have learned and what Menchu has implied is that to her, in her culture, something happening to her community is the same as something happening to her. Basically, that she's not so much one individual person set apart, but rather is part of this community. So when something happens to one person in the community, the whole community is affected. So what this means is that because Menchu's community saw this atrocity happen, it therefore happened to her as well. As far as the physical description that she gives of the scene, this information was surely told to her by her community members who were telling her about this horrible thing that happened to all of them. It's this group-centered mentality and worldview that is important in Menchu's culture and community, and Stoll clearly did not understand this or did not deem it factual when he was writing his book. And what's ironic is that Stoll is an anthropologist. You would think that he would be familiar with ideas like this one and would realize that maybe the epistemology or way of knowing of this indigenous community is different than his own as an American academic, but he seems to have looked past this when writing his book and trying to analyze the validity of Menchu's stories. And I remember in class, Richard talked about one way that we can see how grammar influences our worldview is how we get upset about things because we're taught that those things are worth getting upset about. And I think that this is very applicable to this situation with Stoll. He was upset that Menchu presented something as true, which it was for her, because her definition of truth maybe isn't exactly the same as Stoll's. He was upset because Menchu's way of understanding the world didn't line up with his American academic way of understanding the world, and he felt the need to somehow correct what she had said. I think that this is an example where we can see what Worf is talking about and learn from the situation to understand that maybe when we work with different groups, our ways of learning or knowing things, our epistemologies, aren't always going to be the same. And maybe our distinct grammars are part of what limits our ability to process information the same way another group does. I think this is really important when thinking about development because we could certainly find ourselves in a similar situation and we need to be able to reconcile different epistemologies and work together rather than tearing each other down. Also, another thing to throw in here that I think is worth thinking about, and one that I have discussed in my classes at UVA when we read Menchu's book, is if it really matters anyway. Even if Menchu did fabricate details, which I'm not suggesting she did, but even if she did hyperbolize in order to gain attention for her community, would it really matter? The book is still accurate in its account of the atrocities carried out by the Guatemalan army against indigenous communities. So I guess the idea here is that Menchu's personal narrative can sort of be a vehicle for presenting what happened to a large group of people. That's the point and the premise of the testimonio. One person represents a larger community and they showcase the experiences of this community via storytelling. Some would argue, and I think I agree, that it doesn't really matter if Menchu was present or not when her brother was burned, because even putting aside the epistemological differences, her point still stands, as does the fact, the historic fact, that these things really did happen and these stories need to be shared. Okay, now I want to shift gears a little bit away from Stoll and focused on the idea of buen vivir that Michela Giovanni discusses in her article. Buen vivir is a term that in Spanish means good living or good way of life. And at its core, it's basically a school of thought that emphasizes the importance of indigenous culture, the natural environment, and collective well-being. It's a kind of ethical paradigm that focuses on collective rights. Here's a little bit of what Giovanni has to say about it. Buen vivir is a communitarian view of well-being based on reciprocity and complementarity that valorizes indigenous identity and culture and involves not only human beings but also the natural environment. In the economic sphere, buen vivir has been translated into indigenous local solutions that often take the form of grassroots entrepreneurial initiatives and aim to address a plurality of needs. These self-managed enterprises stress the importance of social context, culture, and local knowledge, and are in fact indigenous solutions for creating processes of change. These initiatives have demonstrated the capacity to provide local forms of endogenous development in a range of contexts. The concept of endogenous development is compatible with buen vivir as it implies the direct participation of local communities in the definition of development objectives and strategies. Then later she writes, Buen Vivir has three innovative aspects. First, it is elaborated by peoples who have been historically marginalized and belong to the periphery of the world. Second, well-being is not conceived in its individualistic Western sense, but rather in the context of a community. And third, the natural environment is a subject of rights. Okay, so basically, Buen Vivir can be understood as an indigenous epistemology that is pretty common among indigenous groups in Latin America. Even though what we're talking about today with the Guatemalan Civil War isn't really an issue of development per se, although I think it can be understood as a form of development, there's still a lot of important information that we can learn from Giovanni's article and see how it affected the way that indigenous communities participated in the Civil War. As we already discussed, Menchu's community holds a deeply communitarian view of well-being. Hers is a community that is pretty internally focused, and the idea that they're very conscious of the ways that they want to preserve their culture and indigenous identity. I think that self-managed is another good description that Giovanni uses that applies to Menchu's community and its process for change. So even though Giovanni might have written this article with a different definition or idea of development in mind, more of an approach of what the West needs to know when working with these type of indigenous communities, I think the Civil War can be seen as a form of South-South cooperation as discussed by Gosevich. And although I don't think anyone would call it Civil War cooperation, I think the underlying idea still exists here, that this was a country who worked out an issue by itself. That's overly simplistic, and it doesn't speak to the violence that occurred, which cannot be taken out of the conversation. But what I think we can see here is an example of two Southern groups who came to a conclusion without the West's intervention, and an important aspect of this conflict was the indigenous way of knowing and how they experienced the world. The communal emphasis that they hold was brutally violated by the Guatemalan armed forces, and this led to further disruption by the guerrillas and indigenous communities like Menchus. Giovanni also writes, in opposition to the neoliberal discourse of assimilation of indigenous people, where traditions and cultures are seen as obstacles to development, indigenous social movements assert their right to remain autonomous. These movements follow a strategy of localization that is directed to the defense of their territory and culture. With firm roots and local communities, these grassroots enterprises have become instruments for reinforcing the protection of indigenous cultures and territories. I think that Menchu's community is a perfect example of this. Indigenous communities in Guatemala were able to secure more rights and benefits from the government, which is a way in which we can see the way that they may still desire to be autonomous and not to assimilate with the rest of the country, but they also want the legal protections they need in this day and age. They want to be independent without being vulnerable. Also, two more things that I think are worth throwing in the ring of this conversation before we move on to the next article is that oral tradition is often important in indigenous communities, and Menchu's testimonio that was shared orally to Burgos and then transcribed is an interesting and, for me, an exciting way of oral tradition and for oral tradition history and understanding to be shared. Also, Giovanni references how women oftentimes are more highly regarded in indigenous communities than in a modernized society, which is usually more patriarchal and male-oriented. And maybe we can see that here with Menchu in that she became a leader in her community and in its fight for justice following her father's death. And as far as I can tell from reading her book, there was no gender barrier to cross in order for her to have the chance to fight for her community and to play a leadership role amongst her peers. Okay, moving on. Crew and Axelby's article is also specifically about development, but I want to try and extract some important points from it that I think can be applied here as well. Again, I know that this is kind of a stretch or an interpretation against the specific context in which they were writing the article, but I hope that by changing the air around which we are discussing these ideas, I can further my ability to think critically and apply outside ideas to different situations. The first idea there that I want to speak on is the idea of development as newsworthy. Crew and Axelby use this word newsworthy to discuss the idea of drawing attention to a movement or to an issue so that it can be expanded and potentially garner more supporters and thus political, social, and financial capital. I think that it's an important idea to keep in mind if the most meaningful work is really that which is gaining the most attention. I think a lot of times the work that everyone is talking about holds a lot of merit, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes really important work and current events get shadowed over by trends in development. I think that you could argue that the same idea, the idea of falling through the cracks of a political hierarchy, was at play with the indigenous movements in Guatemala. I wasn't alive then, but I feel pretty safe in assuming that it wasn't the topic of a lot of conversations in the US amongst academics and politicians. And even though it most likely made it to Guatemalan national newspapers because the state was one side of the Civil War and it was torturing its own citizens, I'm sure there was censorship to at least some degree within the country and internationally. I guess the point I'm making is that we can't rely on newsworthiness to decide where we work or with whom. It's difficult because this seems kind of cyclical. If you don't hear about an issue, how can you be expected to work on it? But I think that this kind of agenda setting comes from physically going to a place and talking to the people there. If you want to work in Guatemala, don't just go to Guatemala City and ask the government what kind of stuff is going on. Get out of the cities, get to know people, ask them what are the issues they and their fellow citizens are facing. For example, in the US, two huge problems that need to be worked on are prison reform and homelessness. Who's going to be the first people to talk about these issues? It's not police officers, it's not the mayor. If people are dying in their prisons or on their streets, they're not going to, they're going to paint a narrative that doesn't totally represent the experiences of individuals. So talk to homeless people, conduct interviews, talk to people who have loved ones in jail, people who have been in jail, or people who are currently incarcerated. Maybe this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but when I read the ideas that Crew and Axelby shared about development as newsworthy, it really resonated with me and I felt that it was applicable to the situation in Guatemala. Next, I want to try and apply some of the ways in which the authors say that development can be misconstrued. So first, Crew and Axelby talk about development as modernization. I guess before starting this discussion, we should say that what we're talking about with this civil war is a form of national development rather than international aid. So by modernization, Crew and Axelby mean that oftentimes a dangerous assumption is made that development equals modernization. That is, if countries in the global south can just adopt Western infrastructure, they will develop and their problems will be eradicated. It assumes that development is akin to a likeness with the West, a similarity to the global north. It assumes that countries cannot determine their own futures and that instead they need the West to steer them in the right direction. So could you say that the civil war in Guatemala pushes back against this idea? I mean, as a result of this war, indigenous people saw their legal rights augmented and improved, and it was determined internally without intervention from the West. People who argue might say that it was done in a barbaric way and that there was a grave loss of human life. But I think there is also room to say that this revolution by indigenous communities in Guatemala pushes back on the modernization as development paradigm. And in a similar vein, Crew and Axelby also talk about development as empowerment. This is a similar idea to development as modernization because it assumes that the West has some sort of power that it can and must impart on the global South, that the South is lacking some form of personal power that the West has and can share with it. While the West may have resources that the South could benefit from, even something as simple as food, for example, wherein lies the problem with this paradigm or school of thought is that people living in the global South are somehow less than compared to Westerners. That there's something in a Western person that they can give to a poor person to make their lives better. Usually the people who are deemed as needing to be empowered are those who are the most vulnerable, so people like women, minorities, indigenous groups, queer communities, etc. This war between the Guatemalan state and the indigenous communities sort of turns this idea of empowerment on its head, but it's still playing on the same hierarchy, which is why I think that it's important to bring it up. Rather than a top-down approach of empowerment, the situation was quite the opposite. It was a top-down attempt at disempowerment. The hierarchy at play is that indigenous people are weaker than the state, that with sheer force, indigenous groups can be shut down, basically, just because they're indigenous, which is seen as being less than, less advanced, less savvy, less knowledgeable, etc. And the indigenous communities of Guatemala proved that this is not true, and in fact, they used very cunning and clever methods to fight back against the Guatemalan armed forces, which eventually led to a greater recognition of their legal rights. A quote from Kurt Axelby that perfectly describes the situation here is, "If people are given the space to empower themselves, they tend to work outside expected parameters." That certainly seems to be the case with communities like Manchus, and it's important to keep in mind when working in development in general. I have to wonder how the war would have looked differently had an outside group come in to help the indigenous peoples. I wonder if things would have ended differently than how they did with just the indigenous people fighting for themselves. They were given the space to empower themselves, albeit in a context of urgency and bloodshed, and they worked outside expected parameters against the assumed power hierarchy of the state in order to gain rights for themselves. In keeping with this idea of anti-development by the Guatemalan state, I want to briefly touch on the idea of development or anti-development as discourse. In this section, the authors talk about symbols and rituals. And I think we definitely see that here with the symbology the state used when burning Manchu's brother alive in front of his entire community. This gross atrocity sent a clear message to the indigenous peoples that the worst punishments would not be spared if they fought back against the state. I think that this burning was a form of discourse. It was a way for the state to promote anti-development by using fear tactics against its supposed enemies. The last thing I want to mention before moving on to an important note on anthropology raised by Kurt Axelby is the idea of development as freedom. This isn't one of the fallacies that the authors write about, but they include some references to Amartya Sen, the author of the book Freedom as Development, 2 chapters of which I read for Gabby's class and wrote a paper about. Sen's argument is that personal freedom and individual liberty must be the end of development, like what developers are striving to promote across the world. I actually agree with him in large part, but a question that was raised for me when thinking about freedom as development and this indigenous community is, where do freedom as development and buen vivir intersect? Sen says that individual liberty is the end goal, but is that not true for communities like Manchus who value community over individualism? Maybe for them the end of development is freedom, but not for the individual. So in communal liberty, the end goal of development projects that adopt and work with the ideas of buen vivir would replace this idea of individualistic freedom. I think it's an important intersection to think about, and when it gets glossed over or overlooked, I think that we do an injustice and perpetuate the way that indigenous people have been mistreated throughout history in general, by ignoring their philosophies and assuming that everybody wants personal freedom as an individual. Okay, the last thing I want to bring up from this article is the role that anthropology can play in development. And this is worthwhile because Manchu's first book was written by an anthropologist. Like I said, the book is comprised of Manchu's oral stories, which she told to Venezuelan anthropologist Elizabeth Burgos de Prey. And Crew and Axelby talk about how anthropologists attempt to move past their situated knowledges as much as possible in order to study a culture and its participants in a just way. However, the authors write this: "The point for anthropology is that reflecting on one's own role in the research has become highly relevant to the researcher's understanding. Some anthropologists have gone as far as saying that ethnography is so much the product of a particular anthropologist's view and experience that it is a form of autobiography. But most would explore the relationship between researcher and object rather than giving the anthropologist such a central role. At the least, anthropologists try to reflect on how they see and interpret and what role has been played by their own gender, race, age, class, politics, assumptions, and so on." This is important to understand when thinking about the fact that Burgos is the one who listened to the stories, compiled them, and put them in order to form a coherent story. She decided what to include and what to leave out, even though Manchu is speaking from her own Mayan community rather than of it. There's still a person a personal touch that gets lost in the book because it goes through this publication process via Burgos, and she influenced the book when she was comprising it. Also, the interviews took place in Burgos' apartment in Paris, where Menchú stayed with Burgos rather than Burgos going to Guatemala. This was in part because Menchú lived in exile in Mexico during the last few years of the 20th century, so perhaps going back with Burgos and seeing all the places mentioned in her story wasn't really a possibility, which I'm not blaming anyone for. I'm just saying that it's important to recognize the influence that the anthropologist had over this work. Finally, I want to finish with the interview by Angela Davis. The most important point that Davis brings up in this interview is the intersectionality of struggles. She says that when comparing struggles across different cultures in different parts of the world, we need to form personal connections and relate things back to what we know so that people feel personally passionate about the issues going on in the world. She gives the example of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and the occupation of Palestine, or the civil rights movement in the US and apartheid in South Africa. She says that when people feel like they have access to movements because of a personal connection or a similar experience, people will start to see other movements as their own. She says that in order to get involved, you don't need to be an expert because it's personal. When you can connect with a movement or struggle halfway across the world because you draw similarities between it and your own experiences, movements will gain support and momentum from people even outside of their cultures and countries. Another interesting point briefly mentioned by Davis is that language can be a way to promote an agenda. For example, the Occupy movement sparked the idea of the 99% versus the 1%, which is an idea that is now largely understood and used to speak on economic inequality. So Davis says that language is another way to incorporate a universal and cohesive nature to movements and struggles, and that if phrases like these get adopted, then they will further shine light onto the issues at hand. I think this is an interesting point to compare to Worth, which is that language affects the way we see the world. Davis is saying that this can be done in a positive way, and it can actually be a tool that movements can use to garner support. To conclude this podcast, I want to read a quote from Crew and Axelby's article. I think it applies well to movements and development in general, and it certainly is applicable to the situation of Menchú and other indigenous communities in Guatemala during the second half of the 20th century. Here's what they wrote. In the search for universal explanations, complex realities are manipulated and simplified until they conform to a convenient narrative. Limited fields of vision reinforce themselves by avoiding and excluding ideas, people, and experiences that do not conform to expectations. Institutional and ideological structures tend to bend reality to their perspectives rather than extending their visions to encompass the full diversity of reality. Unable to look beyond the obvious, values are left unquestioned and unchallenged by alternative perspectives, so that complexity, externality, and contradiction are dismissed in an increasingly complex and multipolar world. This concludes today's podcast. Thanks for listening.